Back in the 80s, we put on parties in the desert, and we called ourselves Desolation Center.
Is the punk movement part of the Nazi movement?
No, that's the police. That's the Nazi movement.
The early 80s was a time of experimentation and rebellion.
The LAPD freaked out about punk rock like it was the second coming of the Black Panthers.
I started thinking I need to apply some of the out-of-the-box punk rock thinking. Why couldn't we put this kind of really cool music into this desert environment? How many things could go wrong, you know?
I immediately understood the element of danger and the element of feeling alive are actually connected.
Everything that I found exciting at the time, all gear in this remote spot.
Total anarchy.
That desert environment is awesome for acts of freedom.
Desolation Center was one of the inspirations when we started doing Burning Man.
It was beyond the theory, you know, it was made real. This gig makes total sense.
And I just remember thinking, this is transformative. Those shows reflected that spirit of, I'm going to make it happen.
It was definitely one of those doors that opens and you're kind of different on the other side.
I was kind of hoping to see the hillside come down on everybody, but that's my disappointment.
Woo! The film that has it all. Explosions, fire, loud music, fast men, faster women. So wonderful to see that. And welcome, everybody. This is dublab presented Desolation Center discussion. My name is Frosty from dublab. We just watched the trailer for the Desolation Center film. And I realized that if you're joining us, you might have seen the film already. You might not have seen the film, or you might want to see it again. So I want to just up top forward you over to desolationcenter.com if you want to explore more. And such fascinating story and movement. And today we're joined by some of the people behind the movement, by the visionary who started it all, Stuart Swezey here, also the director of the film. We also have Mariksa Leyssius, photographer, musician, participant, collaborator within Desolation Center, and also producer of the film. And we have Shelley of Sonic Youth, who played at the Solstice event in 1985, the final Desolation Center event, and just shared an incredible set on dublab. By the way, you can find it in the dublab.com archives. Welcome, everybody. How are you all?
Good. Hey, good to see you.
Yeah. Thanks, Frosty, and everybody at dublab for putting this together. Very psyched to be here.
We're psyched to have you here. And, you know, we're fascinated by music cultures that are pushing envelopes, and you know, all new things come from people who are trying to push into the beyond, who are not content with the status quo or find the fractures and flaws in the status quo and want to kind of push into a new world. And music is such a powerful, potent way of doing that. We're all immersed in music and also building culture and community. And Desolation Center, in its different forms, its different iterations, even though it had a really short life, it lives on because of the message, the mission, the people behind it. And all of these kind of movements are usually built on a strong kind of ethos and intention. And Desolation Center really had that to start. So I'd love if you don't mind, Stuart, to maybe read the Desolation Center manifesto, because I think it's really powerful.
Sure. So if you saw the film, it appears in it. And this was from the time before we were actually doing shows out in the desert. It was just an idea of a nomadic way to put on gigs with the kind of more experimental end of the punk rock industrial spectrum. And so I'll just read it and you know, hopefully it'll speak for itself, but it was definitely young and you know, idealistic and rebellious at the time.
That works.
So, all right. So this is the Desolation Center Statement of Principles. Desolation Center will only run every other weekend. This gives us the ability to offer quality bands and not dilute the caliber of the presentation just to fill up the schedule. We book bands on the basis of raw talent and or musical integrity, not drawing power. If you feel like you'd like to perform, poetry, video, etc. included at the Desolation Center, send your tape or other information to 1428 Sherbourne Drive, LA, California, 90035. And I'm not at that address anymore. Desolation Center is not a profit-making venture. All revenue obtained above and beyond the overhead will be used to compensate the bands, improve the club, and lower ticket prices in the future. There will be no guest lists. Everyone but band members and Desolation Center volunteers must pay to get in. We are opposed to the practice of letting people free because they, quote, know someone. We do not solicit any press coverage for Desolation Center events. We feel that local press coverage in music has become self-serving and upholding of mediocrity. Therefore, we refuse to court the favor of self-appointed dictators of cool. Quote, you will never see Desolation Center advertised in the LA Weekly, in case you're wondering who we were talking about there. The only thing worse than a cop is a fuck up. If you have self-destructive tendencies, please vent them in Hollywood. Alcohol brings cops. We refuse to sell drinks to a captive audience at exorbitant prices. Please feel free to bring your own booze if you are of age. And the last one, no dancing required. We would rather shut down than become a new wave disco.
Amazing.
So just to be clear, we were not anti-disco. We were more anti the kind of like sleazy Duran Duran type clubs that were going at the time.
What was the, this is a strong framework to build something on. And what was in the air? What were you feeling in order to kind of, because the punk movement, and you talk about it in the film, Sean talks about it famously, it was inclusive in many ways, but it also grew to a bigger level. But what was the kind of spark to try something new?
I think it was a combination of two things. One is that when I was still like high school age, there was a club called the Brave Dog that was run by a guy named Jack Marquette, which was in Little Tokyo. It's kind of like beside this place called the Atomic Cafe that was like the one place that had a punk rock jukebox. And it was a big hangout. It was open 24 hours. I used to go there, and then I would see really amazing music. And then Jack went on to do theoretical nights and the Anti-Club and these other things that really brought together different groups. And the other thing you had going was the Sunset Strip, which was still sort of before the, Poison, Hair Farmer era. But so they had some great music, but it was still run with a sort of rock and roll sensibility of, Bill Gazzari, the godfather of rock and roll, and I didn't feel like that was a place for the kind of music that we liked, people like Mariksa that were doing, more experimental punk rock approaches. It wasn't a great environment for that. So I wanted to kind of think about, well, how can we present music in a more just stripped down, austere way,
Yeah. And Mariksa, when did you first kind of catch wind of this, and what was appealing about that sort of ethos to you?
Well, it's interesting when you say the word community, because the world is so big now. We had our own little community, and it was diverse, and the music, I'm so lucky to be in it, was just so amazing. So, and I grew up lived in Highland Park at the time. So I grew up in LA, and I was in, it did change my life when I first heard the music. So.
And when was the first time that you performed at a Desolation Center event or attended? And what were your thoughts kind of walking in the room? Can you kind of paint a picture of being in that space? And was it different immediately?
I barely remember playing, but I was in a noise band called Salt. Steve played that night. It was at the Solstice. I was more organizing at the time. I wasn't. Yeah. Everyone was in a band then, and I wasn't. I was just playing in noise bands. I wasn't really a musician, but it was more of an art thing. So.
But there's a lot of ways to contribute and participate, you know, and I think that's important. But if everybody just wanted to be a musician, then it would be really boring and nothing would happen.
Right. There wasn't the big up on stage difference. It was community of being part of it, even if you were in the audience. So it was just great that way.
And
I was just going to say that oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. But Mariska and I met with a zine that she was really the first zine I'd ever seen. It was called Contagion. Ironically at the moment, but anyway, so so we started talking. I think that's what led to her being involved in the first desert show and stuff like that.
And Steve, you were able to play at that final solstice event. Your kind of entry point. Had you already heard whispers about that world, and had you known about the prior Sonic Youth show that had happened in the desert? What was your kind of knowledge about the movement that was happening?
Are you kidding? When I joined the band, it was like the greatest thing that had ever happened to them. So I heard about it constantly. And
stop!
No. I always wished that I had been there, you know, to play in the desert with the Meat Puppets and Red Cross and Sonic Youth. So it was a gig that I heard about for many van rides. And eventually, that I did get to play for Desolation Center in December of '85 was it was a really great event. Although everything took a turn at that event because we lost D. Boone that night. So somehow this era ended there. But it meant a lot to me to be amongst those people and those musicians and that part of the LA scene.
Yeah. I wonder, we're lucky to have this film that has so much incredible documentation when it comes to filmed footage, as well as incredible photographs and all of these these bits of documentation. But sometimes before you're able to see that, tales can kind of grow. What was the kind of story through your Sonic Youth bandmates? Like, how was that projected to you as a story? What did you think about the kind of desert shows as they were explaining it?
Oh, just that everybody was on acid and Red Cross were late.
Sounds like a party.
Yeah. Just no, it was really legendary. Talking about the lights being turned off during the Meat Puppets set, and just all the little details of it. It sounded like the coolest gig that I never got to attend. But I'm so happy that the movie exists because I have heard stories of this of all the Desolation Center gigs for decades now.
Yeah. And they were so different. I mean, it seems that to have the sort of vision to create something that literally off the map or on a hand-drawn, warped, wobbled map, it takes a lot of imagination for the kind of prospect of something new. Stuart, was it something that was really you were building as kind of an architect would, or was it more just kind of jumping into the moment?
Wow. I think the part of it was kind of being okay with being in the moment and not feeling like I had to be a control freak about everything. I think that's why things turned out as cool as they did. Mm-hmm. If Mark Pauline had told me at one point, there's going to be a metal plate, it's going to be about 10 feet over the whole audience's head, it'll be flying, I would have said, well, maybe we shouldn't do that, but because I didn't know, it was more just like, yeah, cool, like explosive, sure. And that was because of a lot to do with people that I knew, like Einstürzende Neubauten invited Mark Pauline, Michael Shepard reintroduced me to Kim and Thurston after he put out the Death Valley 69 record. And so things just sort of evolved, and a lot of it had to do with just timing. And so there would be an idea, but at the same time, a lot of it was spontaneity, I think. And I think that kind of reflected the spirit of the times too. People thought big, but at the same time, we had very limited resources. So, it's kind of like, oh, Kim and Thurston are going to be visiting their mom and dad, or, Kim's parents over Christmas. Maybe we should do a gig. So there was that.
And at least if Mark Pauline had chopped someone in half, they would have at least had a great time in the moments leading up to it. So yeah,
sure, You got to end it somewhere sometime. Yeah.
And what did you most want to kind of get out of the experience, or more so, what did you want people to kind of take from it, from say the first Desolation Center event, when you're taking people outside of their environment, and many who were so close to the desert but had never really been in that environment? What were you hoping people would experience there?
Well, a couple of different things. First of all, it seemed like a really good idea to use this other environment to present music, almost like a different frame for this music than the typical nightclub kind of, even if it was a loft or whatever, it just seemed like having this big, expansive sort of extraterrestrial setting would be cool. So it was an experiment. What would happen if we did that? Secondly, it was also a point in time, which I think is addressed in the film, but it was getting really hard to put on shows in LA at that time without being shut down by the cops. And so it was like, well, maybe if we just went way the hell out to the desert, we could get away from all this kind of, LAPD, clampdown thing that's going on. And then the last thing I think was to try to figure out, I love the whole going to a gig and sense of community like Mariksa was talking about. But what if you could expand on that? What if you could make it last longer? What if you could make it different, and I think that was another whole part of it.
And you were probably kind of operating simultaneously on a different level, where you were thinking of the overall expanse of it, and the logistics of it, I imagine, while also trying to be in the moment. Because I know when you're producing a show, you want to be there. The joy is to feel it and to be there, but it's also hard when you're maneuvering and making sure things are going right. But was there a moment in it that you could kind of pause and detach and really feel like I was here? And what was the moment that stood out for you in say that first Desolation Center?
Well, part of it was, being pretty, realistic about how hard it was to do what we were doing. I was really stressed out right up until things kind of came together. And with that show, you got to remember, no cell phones, no GPS. We had a couple porta potties out there. Bruce Leisher from Savage Republic had gotten there the night before and camped out. And I think when we got the buses to the dry lake bed and we saw Bruce, and we were able to sort of have that happen, where the bus drivers actually agreed to drive on the dry lake bed. I was kind of like, this is going to happen. For me, that was that moment. I know Bruce felt the same way from where he was watching the buses come toward him. And then just, hearing the music and realizing, for instance, there was a lot of wind, which I think Mike Watt talked about that. And there was a moment when I'm like, oh shit, I didn't really think about that. Maybe this whole thing's not going to work because of wind. And then, we got the buses to create kind of like a V behind the bands. And so we were able to block the wind. And all of a sudden I was like, okay, this is cool. This is going to happen.
Yeah. So, and it's, those best laid plans are usually the things that crumble. But if you're agile and, moving with the moment, you're able to kind of create something new from it. In the moment there, Mariksa, what was your kind of perception of what was happening, and what were you kind of taking in that space?
Bus monitor. Like Stuart said, when we landed, it was great. And I wasn't concerned with anyone on the bus because everyone knew each other, and if you didn't, you knew each other by halfway through the trip. But it was the bus drivers that I was worried about. So I was really trying to make sure that they knew it was okay, because everyone was drinking and doing things you don't normally do on a school bus. So.
Yeah. It must have been so different for them. What was that kind of waltz with them to try? Were you trying to just keep them chill, or don't look in your rear view mirror?
I mean, I was always good with people's parents, so I was like being that kid. So, but once we landed, it was great. Yeah.
And what's fascinating, I mean, nowadays going out to the desert, I mean, I'm thinking of, especially I've got kids, so it's like the checklist of all the things you need. But watching the film, people are going out with the bare minimum. Like, were people even ready for that, do you think? Or were people just like, I got a ticket, I'm going?
It was pretty much the latter. And there weren't a lot of complaints, or, we didn't, nobody was complaining. We were all in the moment we were also young, but
totally.
It was, once you land, it's like there's no security, there's no cops. It's just us. So
just
great.
you guys. Incredible.
And the Minutemen and Savage.
And you were, Steve, you were already, were you in Michigan at that point, or were you in New York?
I was in Michigan, yes. For the
early phase of Desolation Center?
Yes. Yeah.
And then kind of watching this film now from your kind of vantage point, did this have any sort of connection to, because you're very busy in Michigan and doing a lot of kind of music and community building yourself. Did this feel like an analog of what you were up to out there as far as kind of intention of doing work with the community, or was it just a completely alien world?
I guess you could say that, but it was times 10, the quality of the bands and the quality of the production was a much bigger thing. Everybody across the states in this scene was learning how to do their own shows and learning how to get through that. But taking a show out to the desert with the Minutemen and Savage Republic, that's really something. So I feel like it's on another level.
Mm-hmm. But as far as the idea of kind of the pull to kind of build community around music and art and creativity, the idea of kind of a generous community built from that seems like something that probably resonated with you and was in your blood. When you did start to kind of hear about those things, did it feel like on your wavelength?
I guess so, because I guess that's why I really wanted to be there when I first heard about it. So yeah, it would be on my wavelength. I was living in the Midwest in Michigan and playing in several different bands. And the way that we connected to the outside world was by connecting to the scene in Chicago or the scene in Wisconsin, or Minneapolis. So you would eventually get to Texas. So we were learning about what was going on through your contact in each of these cities, and you sort of had to build it block by block.
And people were used to in certain parts of the country, and maybe the Midwest is, the people are used to kind of driving long distances to see a show. I mean, they might go from one city to the next, but in California and Los Angeles, this real urban hub, sometimes people are in the bubble of, even to get from downtown to Venice might seem like an alien world. The voyage to the desert, were people even just kind of like the landscape of, wow, I mean, the journey is a destination sort of thing. Were you hearing some feedback, Stuart and Mariksa, about just the getting outside of their bubble, like what people were kind of experiencing?
Well, especially when we got off the main road, which was the 10, and got off this bumpy long road, people were like, where are we going? Because you didn't have GPS and didn't have any idea, but they trusted us, and it was fun in a scary way, I guess.
But you did have a lot of people that weren't, they weren't campers, they weren't big on the outdoors back then, and so I think, and it really, when you see the desert environment like that for the first time, it is kind of overpowering. I think maybe some people were kind of surprised at how cool it was, and here it is in our backyard. And that's something I was thinking about, that, it may sound strange now, but I think LA was still a little bit on the defensive about whether we were as punk as New York and London and or even Berlin or whatever. So I thought, well, those guys don't have a desert that they can drive to. Like, this is something that really is distinctive about our area here.
I love that you actually, in a conversation we had earlier, you talk about this kind of epiphany of hearing, there's a sort of a mutant music almost, kind of new forms of noise and industrial and different things post-punk that were coming out of the kind of seeds of that first wave punk scene, and it was evolving. And you had sort of an epiphany in the deserts of Mexico. Can you talk about that and how that might have helped propel some of the destination of the desert for Desolation Center?
Yeah, I mean, I had done these shows sort of like in the spirit of the manifesto, around downtown LA, and that was cool. But they would keep getting shut down by cops. It was getting frustrating. And so when my friend was like, let's just take a road trip, we'll visit my family in Mexico. And so like about 3 of us, jumped in the car. And so I'd never really driven that. So you go through Arizona, then you're in Sonora, and it's just desert, desert, desert. And so we were listening to, the kind of music that we liked, but in this other setting. So it was like Wire, first 3 Wire records. Savage Republic was one of them. PIL, Metal Box, Jaw Wobble. And so it just felt like, whoa, because there was an element of sort of Arabic and sort of dissonance, and it's sort of a spaghetti Western vibe. And so it was perfect. So there was just like, oh, this is cool. But then it made sense to me at that particular moment on the way back. Like, we could just do that. We could have Savage Republic in the desert, but I didn't really know them. So the first people I asked was the Minutemen, because that was, people I'd actually done shows with that I knew would be kind of up for things. So once they were in, I felt better about talking to Savage Republic about it.
You in Savage Republic, I mean, Bruce Leischer, this incredible creative champion who's involved in the fabric of the event from the visual side, but also conceptually, and even being there in the desert the night before, kind of camping out before the first one, being ready for action. But I love in the Mojave Ausug, the Jemaa el-Fnaa performance, which is, you mentioned the kind of Arabic thing, and that's named after the square in Marrakesh, this UNESCO World Heritage Site, where you're having all of these different kind of groups from, the deserts of Morocco, the highlands of Morocco, coming together and playing music in this square. And can you talk about the Jemaa el-Fnaa, either Mariksa or Stuart or Steve, from seeing the film, because it's so evocative of how they greeted the audience and I would say even participants who came into the Mojave Ausug?
Well, I'll just kick it off real quick. I mean, Bruce and I had talked about it, and he knew that Einstürzende Neubauten was going to be playing, and he knew that SRL was going to be playing, and he knew what they were about, Survival Research Laboratories, and he wanted to do something really different. And so the idea was to put the musicians up in the cliffs and play more percussive instruments. And Jemaa el-Fnaa, for people that don't know, I guess I didn't know at the time, is a place in Marrakesh where these musicians come out of the Sahara Desert and they play in this big marketplace. So that was kind of his inspiration. So it's like the desert and percussion. And the idea was that, that they would really use this, these cliffs and things like that as the actual stage, and people would be just sort of surrounded by it, and that they wouldn't know, oh, there's a band playing. It would be more just like you wander in and there's this thing going on.
And so visual as well. I mean, sonically and visually, it really was such a site-specific, incredible thing. Do you remember, Mariksa, when you kind of saw that? And did you already, I imagine you probably already knew that was going to be happening, more so than a surprise, but what was your kind of a recollection of the Jemaa el-Fnaa?
Well, nothing was so structured, like we knew everything that was happening.
Sure.
So I knew it was happening, and anything Bruce does always sounds amazing. It was just, like Stuart said, an otherworldly feeling when you get off the bus in the desert, and then that happened. It was pretty amazing.
And so much on the edge, literally people on the edge of cliffs, or Mark Pauline trying to blow a boulder off the edge, that in retrospect, especially thinking of all the acid and, lysergic motion in people's brains and membranes, like it's so insane. I mean, watching this stuff now and hearing it is phenomenal. And Steve, obviously this, beyond being a participant in Desolation Center, this really spoke to you because you're going to be releasing the soundtrack on your Vampire Blues label. But what is so unique about this sort of Desolation Center for you that you want to continue pushing it forward?
I'm not sure. I guess it could be the era was just so inspiring at the time, and there was just a wealth of new music. And we were lucky to have so much of it in the States with these Desolation Center bands, but also this was going on around the world. So it was just a great time. And Stuart and I have been compiling music that's either in the movie or taken from various Desolation Center gigs. And we hope to have a double LP put together for later this year.
Had you heard the Solstice recordings after, had it been a long time between the show and hearing the recordings again?
Well, yes and no. We did use a couple of those recordings for an EP. I actually played it in the mix. So we did have those recordings fairly early on, but then of course decades went by where you haven't heard this stuff, and then you hear it again, and you're like, oh, that was pretty good. So so we have used some of those recordings as releases, and we hope to include more of them on this this proposed record that Stuart and I are working on.
I mean, it seems like the sound is imbued with the spirit, which probably it transcends maybe even in some points sound quality, although there are some great quality, but it seems that the spirit of, the whole surrounding, the everything that was going on, I mean, it energizes the music in such a way that it wouldn't be in any other setting, which is so cool. Does that come through in the recordings to you? Do you hear, you hear also a lot of other banter, weird psychedelic ramblings as well, which is fun.
Well, it's definitely indie rock, and not, it's before alternative happened. It's before everything was sort of molded into something that could be purchased. It was more of a spirit, and it was an attitude.
Yeah. I love all the fringy moments, of hearing the announcements and the sound guy, talking to the bands, and all of these things that were kind of, the outtakes that give it such a unique vibe. And you've got the different vibes. I mean, the desert shows were really one thing and really something, but also then you also have Joy at Sea as well, which was kind of the elemental inverse of the desert. What was, for people who haven't seen the film and don't know about Desolation Center, Stuart, can you kind of explain what Joy at Sea was? And
yeah, so basically what had happened is that we had done 2 desert shows, one called Mojave Exodus, Savage Republic and the Minutemen. Mojave Auszug was the Neubauten Survival Research Lab one. And I was kind of like thinking, okay, how do I top that last desert show with everything that was going on, people playing road leveling equipment, explosions, all that. So I thought, well, maybe going back to the desert isn't the right move. Maybe it should be. And then the opposite idea hit me, like, how could you use water? And then the Minutemen, it's part of their whole lore, but they come from the harbor of LA, San Pedro, which is really an interesting place. And I almost feel like that band couldn't have come from anywhere else, because it's such a blue collar, strong, longshoreman thing. But there's also always kind of a beat aspect to it. Bukowski ended up living there at the end in the last, 10 years of his life. And so I thought, well, we could do a gig in Pedro on a boat and go around the harbor, and that would still have the Desolation Center spirit. So that was obviously, like, to me, as a huge Minutemen fan, like the ultimate Minutemen gig. But then, they quickly said, well, we could get the Meat Puppets. And then right at that moment, that was like, I was really, really into Meat Puppets too. And so it just seemed like amazing to me to be able to pull that off. And it was really different in the sense of you had a bunch of people packed onto a whale watch boat, going around in a circle inside the breakwater with these giant cranes overhead and stuff, which you can see in the film. But it wasn't like people spreading out in the desert, because it just wasn't physically possible. At a certain point, we just had to say no more tickets. Really, no, we really can't fit more people. Yeah. And then looking back on it, another one of those things, I'm like, why didn't somebody fall overboard? People were so drunk. Some of the interviews that I did, it would be like, actually a lot. It'd be like, yeah, I remember the beginning of the Meat Puppets, but I don't remember anything after around when the Meat Puppets, when the Minutemen started playing. But anyway, not to encourage that kind of thing. But I do feel lucky that, And it was super fun. And it was also, I think, really meaningful for the Minutemen because, you know, a lot of people had to come down from Hollywood and LA, and they'd never been to Pedro at all, you know, and then to see it at night, you know, you rarely get to really do that because it's, you know, it's a workplace, you know.
And Steve played a bit of this dialogue of the Minutemen talking about their kind of ethos and the idea of arts for everyone. He plays in his dublab set, and this idea of kind of the, you know, art, the working person's kind of, you know, energy can be put into art, and that there's no right way or wrong way, but also to kind of be in a space respecting work itself and the connection to longshoremen, to be right there amidst the port of LA and see the cranes and all the stuff working there. It's illustrating something. It is, you know, people who lived in LA might never have been in the desert if they lived in LA, but they also might never have been at the port of LA. So it's like this whole other alien landscape right in your own backyard. But I love the fact that you pulled that out, Steve, also in your set, and this kind of idea of like, you know, working to make something happen. I mean, you're all lifers in art and creativity, which is commendable and important. But can you speak on that, the idea of just being willing to do the work?
Yeah, well, one thing that, you know, I am a huge Minutemen fan. That was actually the first interview that they ever did, and it was me doing the interview. You can't hear my voice, but that's how I met them.
I love it.
Yeah,
it's powerful.
And because it was a cassette zine, and I knew the editor, Chris Marlowe, and I talked her into. Anyway, so we became friends after that, and I thought what they had to say was so amazing that even, you know, these ideas that were already there by that time, and it is inspiring. I mean, I think you could say it equally about Sonic Youth. I mean, people that just get up every day and do work, you know, creatively, you know, whether it's just working to pay the bills, to do the creative stuff. Either way, I think that kind, and that was a big SST Records thing also, you know, just rehearsing all the time, putting out records, putting out other people's records, putting out zines, you know, whether it be Raymond Pettibone's Tripping Corpses, that he's now, you know, world famous artist, etc. So I think, you know, that is like a little secret lesson about, you know, all this alternative punk rock stuff. It's a lot of work, and you know, I think everybody involved in this group and dublab, I'm sure it is equally a product of just, you know, being willing to kind of like do the unglamorous stuff that goes along with it, puts you in a position to do cool stuff that isn't part of the kind of corporate media world.
Absolutely. Yeah, somebody's got to load the shit out, somebody's got to like make it happen, you know. It's wild. And for you, Steve, that sort of idea of kind of the you know, the labor of music, but it's a labor of love, but it's also a lot of sweat kind of equity put into it. What was your kind of alignment with that?
I would just agree with you, but I was thinking while Stuart was just talking there that the way that a lot of us were able to tour America after these days was mostly because of people like Black Flag and the Minutemen, because they sort of wagon trailed the club system, because there wasn't a really an easy way for underground bands to travel and go from city to city. And so that was all connected to, you know, to Stuart and SST and Desolation Center. It all comes back to home.
Wow. And I'm sure things that, you know, Contagion magazine, things like that, these kind of zines that we're also supporting in a text form. I mean, these things we're getting out there, dispersing, even sometimes slowly, whether mail order or hand to hand, you know, bands leaving a zine in on somebody's couch, you know, as they're touring. What were you, Mariksa, trying to, as far as fulfilling or fortifying what was happening musically, community building? What was your kind of intention with either Contagion or just even helping, you know, be a bus monitor, make all of these things work?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, we did a lot of collages and photographs of the bands, because back then, if you were a photographer, you had to be Life magazine or Rolling Stone. So it was our way to get the word out of bands that no one else would see. And also, that's how I met Stuart. I sold him one in front of the Anti-Club for a quarter. It was a good way to, we didn't use words like networking because it was all organic.
Yeah.
It was how I met a lot of people. It was just a nice community and giving spirit of everyone sending photos. It was just a way to communicate to the community. So.
Yeah, super organic kind of networks. I love also, I was thinking, the joy at sea, you're talking about this kind of, you mentioned, Stuart, it was a miracle nobody fell overboard, and thank goodness they didn't. But, I'm sure a lot of people want to be on the top deck there, but also was it Lawndale and was it Points of Friction? Or
yeah,
right. Points of Friction playing below.
Yeah.
Can you guys talk about the scene below the deck? And I'm sure that if you're in this vessel, like it's also must have been intense. But Mariksa or Stuart, what was that vibe below deck at Joy at Sea?
Well, I have a propensity to seasickness, so I was more off on the side of the deck up top, so Stuart could.
Okay.
We realized that we had this whale watch boat, and there was a deck on top, and we actually, some of the people from Mariska's band, SciComm, Aaron and Perry, who went on to do, Jane's Addiction and all that, Lollapalooza and everything, they built the stage. But underneath, I'm like, what are we going to do with this part? And Points of Friction, for the people that maybe had not heard of them, it was like a slideshow, like it's all analog with tape delay, tape music, Joseph Hammer and other people. Hammer, and so I was a big fan of Points of Friction, and I was like, that isn't going to, maybe in this more sheltered environment, this could work. And then Lawndale had just gotten together, I think, might have been one of their first gigs. And they were all, basically like a Latter-day Surf, kind of Ventures kind of instrumental band. So I thought, well, that'll be cool as well. It won't be quite as raucous, because it's kind of like, it's nice to have things going on, even when the bands aren't playing. People go upstairs and downstairs, and there's, so it was just kind of a hang,
And Lawndale had to get as many gigs as possible to try to buy new power tools for their father, because Einstürzende Neubauten destroyed them at Mojave Ausgang. Steve Housen never really told me about that till we got around to doing the interview. That was one of those stories that came out. I'm like, oh yeah, okay. It's an incredible moment. I'm sure that through the making of the film, you started to kind of like fill in, the full scene of what was happening, because you can't have eyes everywhere. Mariska and Stuart, you guys were embedded and doing the thing and present, and Steve playing, but you don't catch every bit of it. So it's phenomenal. And also the documentation, I mean, people must have known, or maybe it's just a reflection of the artistic community, kind of documenting culture went in hand with the action. Why do you think there was such great documentation of the moments?
Well, I think Mariska is one of the people that did it. I mean, really, when I started thinking about how I could make a documentary about these shows, she was the first person I contacted. And I think I had to talk you into printing some of these negs,
Well, I had to find them. They're in my parents' garage, negatives and boxes. But we started a Facebook page, and little people would say, I have photos. And
amazing.
But then you could tell them about the footage with Randall Kennedy. That was hard to get.
Well, so there was stills, which I think some of the, people like Frederick Nilsson and Scott Allen, we used a lot of his images also. And I mean, there's just lots of people that were just very talented photographers. So thankfully they were into the same scene and they were going to these shows. As far as the footage goes, that was almost like a little bit of a detective project for me. That's where I really felt like I earned my documentarian stripes, because there was a guy, Gary Walco, who I knew had filmed it, and he made a short film about the second desert show. But really the reason why we have the buses and things like that is because he really documented everything really well. But a lot of that footage didn't end up in his short 12-minute film because it was the producer had a warehouse factory out in Rancho Cucamonga, which is, on the way out to the desert. And it was all in storage out there. And so it was really like one of those things where I got there and he goes, oh, it's good that you came, because I was going to throw all this stuff out and move to South Carolina. And I think he's now in South Carolina. So anyway, we got it all digitized, and then we got little bits and pieces that, help tell the story. And sometimes you just need to have all that source footage. So there was that. There's Flipside that was doing video that shot Sonic Youth and Red Cross and SciComm and all that. And so that was kind of like a transitional thing for them from being a zine into doing all this video documentation. Just, I mean, different people, you know, shot it, and then, but it's kind of like a big collage where you really have to mix the audio. You know, sometimes there was only one person, Bob Durkee, who had recorded the audio that we ended up using for Joy at Sea, and you know, so on and so on and so on. Anyway, so it was a big collaboration to make it feel the way it does.
Thank goodness that it was documented. And I think time and time again throughout history, people say, you know, in the moment, you're living the moment, you're taking part of the moment. And it's hard to kind of see that moment from the other side, you know, but there is power in documentation and archiving. Sometimes too much when you're at shows or whatever, you know, people are there with their phones. That's too much. But the idea of kind of having these kind of documents, you know, I think that all of you are involved in publications, whether record labels or zines or book publishing as well. So that seems like it's good to kind of carry the culture forward. Steve, for you, with all the projects you've been involved in, how has kind of the archival element been important? And seeing something like Desolation Center, does it sort of ring the bell of, okay, like, let's try to gather and kind of keep this story pieced together?
Yeah, there's always things that we're collecting or archiving for some future project. So what Stuart has done with Desolation Center has been a big inspiration for Sonic Youth and their archive. And there's just, you know, with the archive, it's just like there's just always more to do. So it's kind of a never-ending job, because someone will, now with Facebook and all this stuff, you know, someone will send you a film that you never knew existed, or photos that you never saw. And so it's really interesting. It does make you gaze back once in a while to the old days, but it is fun to see this, because I was there and I would never know that there had been film or that there were photos of, you know, certain shows and events.
Oh, one other thing, sorry, just want to say about documentation is that, you know, Frosty, when we met, Mariska and I and Lori Steelink and Craig Ibarra had organized this art show in the middle of working on the film, and that was down in San Pedro at Cornelius Projects. And I think that kind of thing actually really helped bring more things out, you know.
I can imagine, yeah.
And we found out about Naomi Peterson's photos through her brother, and, you know, she was an amazing photographer that did a lot of work with SST, and so that was just we wouldn't have had any of the stills of the Solstice show had not that happened. So anyway, it's kind of like the more you put out there, the more you get back. And Steve, you know, Steve's doing amazing stuff on Bandcamp of Sonic Youth too, which is another whole archive.
Another archive, yeah.
And the idea of kind of the ripple effect, I think, in all this stuff is really important, that the people who are there, who then are inspired. I think that's, again, this kind of manifesto that we started this conversation with, to kind of have a real, you know, a kernel of intention and this thing that you can kind of a guiding light to kind of move through these things. It's always evolving, but through actions. I know with dublab, you know, a lot of what we do is with the idea of inspiring others to do. It's not to say, look at us, we're doing this. It's, we're doing this, but we're encouraging you to also, if you're inspired, do your own thing, put your own twist on it. And that's how culture kind of builds out. There's that film 24-Hour Party People in this moment where there's a freeze frame when I think was it Sex Pistols playing, and they freeze frame, they're showing all of the people, and this kind of, you know, modestly intended thing, but all these people went on. And I think with the Desolation Center show at Cornelius Projects, you were seeing the kind of auxiliary, the art and the things created by people who are so inspired by that moment. But also this has gone on to help inspire, lay the groundwork and blueprints for things like Coachella, Lollapalooza, Burning Man. The ethos breeds, you know, and the action breeds kind of new action for all of you. Like how important is that as sort of a kind of a byline or a through line in what you do as artists and documentarians? how important is that to kind of then spark other action from people?
I guess I'll go.
Go ahead.
Let's all go at the same time. All the same time.
Yeah. No. I mean, to me, that was part of the idea of making a film, was not to make it nostalgic, even though it was about the past. And so hopefully we walked the line of some of the things that we put at the end, like our friend Ma talking about, how that we just did these things in the moment. And I feel like coming out of the era of basically no live music, it seems like a good time. I hope that people get and they just get inspired to do wacky stuff and don't have it all planned out. And it's okay to if it's small scale, because it could be more intense if it wasn't a big thing that you can count on happening every year and stuff. So anyway, if people get that out of the film, I think that would be great.
And I think the film being able to kind of reach into people's bubbles where they are now, to kind of like everybody, if you go to desolationcenter.com, and also right now there's this streaming through, if you go to dublab.com/events, you'll find out about a promo code to be able to watch the film for a discounted amount. But the idea of, you might be in a bubble, but you're part of a continuum, a creative continuum. This is all connected, and so you can hopefully watch this film and take something from it to put your own twist on it. Mariksa and Steve, like in your work, I'm sure you've heard people coming to you and saying like, oh, you did this thing that blew my mind, and Contagion made me want to start a zine, or SciComm or Sonic Youth inspired me to start a label or a band. But is that important to you, and how so, in your kind of work? How does that fold into what you do?
Well, you mentioned intent. I think if the intent is just to keep creating rather than build a big monster or something, then you can inspire within the block, your own block at home. It doesn't have to be the world. And
absolutely, it's important. Yeah.
And
Steve,
I hope Stuart mentioned Ma. She is our own little poet laureate from Cerritos, by the way. So.
Amazing.
And we ended the film with her quote, because it was intent to inspire people to do their own whatever it is they wanted to create. So
that's beautiful. And Steve, you were kind of coming up in a space that was connected to cultural hubs, but in Midland, Michigan, was probably it's not New York City. The idea of kind of building culture from there, I'm sure that you were inspired by something from outside to do something from within.
Yes, exactly. It was the things that made it through, whether it was seeing the Talking Heads on Saturday Night Live, or reading about punk rock, and of all places, the Rolling Stone, or finally finding a college radio station that played Laurie Anderson. These were all clues that something was going on, and something different from the mainstream, for those of us who weren't enjoying the mainstream, especially there in the early 80s. So all of these things that came through were kind of smoke signals or communiques or whatever. They were the inspiration back then to keep searching and to keep working on this. And I guess now when I hear from people who are in a faraway place or not so far away place, it's nice to hear that they've been likewise inspired by something that you've been involved with. Usually I brush that off pretty quickly and tell them to go, go rock on and do their thing, but it's nice to hear for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of smoke signals, Lottie from dublab was suggesting maybe if there are any questions that any of the viewers have that they would like to pose to these incredible humans here. So maybe I'll keep an eye on the chat. One thing that I would love to kind of talk about it, and in the film, there's the idea of when Einstürzende Neubauten is playing, this shamanistic sort of, very visceral noise music, but it was reaching people on a really transcendent therapeutic sort of level. But the power of kind of live sound and live music moments, we're away from that, unfortunately, right now. But for all of you, like that sort of transcendent power to kind of beam into the core of somebody. Can you comment on that, or moments that you've had within Desolation Center that you experienced that?
I guess I'll just say that, like, I'm glad that came across in the film, because that was my recollection of Neubauten. Maybe not to the degree of like complete and total, like, psychoanalytic catharsis, but it definitely, like, it's pretentious to say it was a ritual, because that word gets thrown around so much, and a lot of times it's not a ritual. But that was kind of my idea, was to have this feeling, but because of the desert setting, and Neubauten and their ideas kind of played into that. But it happened at other points too, where just the audience and the performers were more connected, and that somehow they could be on a wavelength, and I thought the idea of punk originally, like at least in the Sex Pistols definition, was that the audience and the performers were more on the same level. And so that was another thing of, like, if you strip away all the bullshit of kind of gigs, like, could you have that happen? And the fact that it did, a few times for a few people, to me is just really cool. And I think that's another aspect of music.
Yeah, I love that Blixa from Neubauten talks about it as a mirror. He's saying you're thinking you're seeing something in it, but it's really a reflection of yourself, which is really this mind-blowing sort of thing of, like, I think a lot of music performances is you're sort of kind of having the ego beam back at you in a weird way. But Steve, as I'm sure that you've got people, and Mariksa, after gigs, kind of like having these moments, probably heightened by LSD or other things, but also just pure music has a great power to do this. But any of your experiences, either as performers or participants and audience members, of that sort of transcendent sound connection?
It's sort of hard to keep track of that stuff when it happens. It's usually secret or personal. I mean, it's such a great moment with Blixa there, but I don't think I could one up that at all.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, incredible to hear in the film, like these sort of things that were kind of coming out of it, and the magic of that moment, the atmosphere, creating the possibility for that is phenomenal. Steve, for the solstice event, I know that you mentioned, of course, with D. Boon's passing, it was such a tragic, kind of thing. But solstice is maybe this balance, and kind of light and dark, and these sort of things that through life and music, it's a balance of sorrow and joy as well. But can we focus on the joy of that as well, coming into that final Desolation Center event, also having the memory through your bandmates or the stories of the Desolation ones prior? Can you kind of paint a picture of that event for you, and how you felt kind of being there and playing?
Sure. Well, of course, we didn't know about D. Boon's accident until after the event had happened. So it was a abnormal gig, because this was a Desolation Center gig. It was at a warehouse in downtown LA, and being an outsider of California, was just learning about downtown and how back in those days no one really went down there. And this was this was a really inspired choice by Stuart to have to make the venue there. But I just remember being happy to play for the people who made up Desolation Center, because I had heard so many stories about the desert gig, it was only a year, but it was a lot of time, reminiscing about these gigs that Stuart had been putting together. And so it was somewhat a normal gig. I remember the Swans doing their sound check, and that it appeared that it was snowing in the building and in the warehouse, and it was dust from the rafters that hadn't been moved in decades.
Wow.
Coming down and covering everybody and like gear off the side of the stage. We had this little dust bunnies on it, from the Swans, just like shaking this building, and of course, we also played with Saccharin Trust, who became friends of ours and one of our favorite groups to play with. So it was, and Naomi Peterson was there taking photos. It was sort of just being, dropped into your SST fantasy, your California SST fantasy, where, the Minutemen were around. Lee was playing through D Boone's amp that night. The legacy of the meat puppets and everything about SST and Southern California was just awe-inspiring in those days.
Amazing.
Yeah, it was just so much fun.
And this sort of space, I mean, was this, I know that this was a different sort of event as far as going full circle of now having the NEA putting in money to kind of help manifest this, but it was still trying to do something really off the grid, even within the city itself. Was that space something that were there hoops and hurdles involved with this production wise, or was it a little more straightforward as far as let's just stage something in an interesting environment?
Well, it was something that, somebody that was familiar with the Desolation Center shows, Nick Green, was part of this thing called the Foundation for Art Resources, and he was a big aspect of kind of the behind the scenes thing. And so he said, "Oh, there's this Mission Furniture company. I think we could rent it out for a gig." And then we went there, and it was just like, wow, this is not thinking about the roof, falling in on people and stuff like that, but just that this is really like an urban wasteland kind of setting. And it wasn't too many blocks from where I used to live, with Bruce Leischer from Savage Republic and Independent Project, and Michael Shepard, who had been my big inspiration and promoting shows, and where Steve and Sonic Youth did a show on the street.
True, yeah.
That summer that you can see a little bit of the footage of D Boone, is I think from that event. So it was like a place that was comfortable, but at the same time, I think once you put in the power of this music and the Rat Sound, who now do Coachella and things like that. I mean, it was a really powerful PA for a Desolation Center gig. So it felt like a kind of a different approach. Again, it was, I wasn't thinking of it as the end of the line. I was thinking of it more like another kind of twist in what we were doing.
Yeah. And downtown LA has changed greatly, but things always change. And I think it's sort of this, it's a trap in a way to say, I wish things to be caught in nostalgia, the sticky goo of it, to say this was, the days where anything was possible. There are new possibilities always. It just sometimes takes greater invention, and you're up against things, whether it be gentrification or coronavirus. But do you guys have any sort of words of wisdom or encouragement for people who want to kind of push forward new ideas and manifest something that is different, on their own terms?
Well, I've been following a few things on Twitch. It's virtual, but I don't know. I do miss the live music. I think there's a question for Steve. Actually.
There's a question. Let's see. Let's see if Lottie wants to type those in. Okay. So we'll see if we can get those questions. We have a couple questions to float in. But I mean, it is tricky. I think that it's easy to say I'm not going to do something because there aren't, these places available. I think through the action of Desolation Center, it's like you can then push beyond, and there's always a horizon out there. It's just about kind of getting there with innovation and trying something different, and I think it's sort of the cyclical nature of it, is that there's always new culture, always potential for new culture to be made, and I think that's really important.
And like when the pandemic started, I remember that we got kind of excited because dublab did a very like pop-up event, right, where there was people could drive up to in a parking lot in a supermarket, and there was like music playing through their speakers, and so you got to kind of work with whatever is at hand, I think.
Yeah. Speaking of at hand, so now I'm pushing into new kind of frontiers because I just clicked on the comments thing and actually see these comments. So apologies for not seeing these. So maybe we could talk about them a bit. We've got, we'll go just for ease, kind of, most recent back from Will Kinney. Where in the desert was the Desolation Center event? And I know there were a couple different locations.
Okay, well, I can tell. Basically, there's a place called Soggy Dry Lake, which is a dry lake bed that's not too far from Joshua Tree, and it's the nearest town is called Lucerne Valley. So that's where we did the first one, and that's also where we did the one, the Gila Monster Jamboree one, which was the last desert show. But two different corners of it. Like one was the flat dry lake bed, and then the other part is more like there's some, we kind of learned, let's go where there's some rocks behind where the bands will be playing. And then the second desert show with Neubauten and SRL, it was a place called Box Canyon, which is near Mecca, California. So if you go sort of south from the 10 to Mecca, you'll see it on your right, or if you're coming up. So those were the desert shows, and then obviously Joy at Sea was in San Pedro Harbor.
We've had another question from Let's Don't. Steve would love to hear more about the compilation release you're working on that we talked about up top on Vampire Blues. So you mentioned a double LP.
Yeah. Stuart and I have been working on this for a bit. COVID has slowed us down a little, but we will eventually get it finished. And it's basically a double album, inspired by the music from the movie, and also hoping to include music actually from some of the desert shows themselves. So I don't know. Stuart and I have been kicking this around. We're trying to keep it interesting and have a few surprises in there.
I'm excited about it, and I'm sure it'll include some beautiful photos or art or liner notes as well, because the story's deep.
Yeah, it has to be done well, so that's why we're taking our time on this one.
Yeah.
And also we're going to be bringing Bruce Leischer from Independent Project Press in as the designer. He has his own, for people that know, he has his own letterpress press that he does work on. So anyway, we'll all be kind of collaborating together on that.
Beautiful. I love at some point somebody saying he was kind of it's like the Gutenberg press of the punk scene or something. I forget if it was Don Bowles or somebody else said it, but that was really nice. Somebody asked, does LSD cause brain damage? I'm not an expert, but depends. It can, depends what door you open.
I will say it does affect your hearing if you go see the Swans to where you're. I will say.
Is that could just be volume though too.
Might have just been the Swans.
Well, I mean, was the question, does it cause brain damage?
Brain damage.
I mean, I can also, I believe, cause reprogramming that can be a positive force in your life as well. I mean, it's like anything else. It's how you approach it, and being dependent on it for creativity is probably not a very good idea. But definitely can be a positive force.
There's this Grateful Dead documentary, Long Strange Trip, that I've been watching. It's kind of a long multi-part, and that plays a big part of it. But I think that, bringing that up, because again, it's sort of this, multi-generational kind of continuum thing that I think is so important. We're all from different places, different backgrounds, whether we're in the same city or otherwise, but we're doing our own thing. And I think that we're all participants in this universe. And so hoping that people can view Desolation Center film or view the Grateful Dead film or the Tammy Show documentary or whatever, kind of like to immerse yourself in culture that's come before, hopefully to build your own culture, even if that's within your own home, and within your own family unit or friend circle, but experimenting, whether that's LSD or other natural forms, but just pushing forward and not being afraid to kind of open kind of new windows. Noah Klein, who's in the chat, is a community builder that I appreciate greatly. And there's a lot of other incredible people who talked about here also the idea of cassettes and zines kind of floating around. I mean, there's different ways we're in this kind of hyper speed of information exchange, and there's a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop that can occur. But, we're all here trying to put something positive into the world so that it can grow and kind of multiply and manifest in the right way. I love the fact that in Southern California, within the documentary, within Desolation Center, to have the voices of the people who are there and contributing in whatever form. We're lucky to be in this space where there are, it exists around the world, these different hubs, but there are these lifers. Mike Watt, shout out to somebody who charging forward and doing it in an ego-free manner, doing it to do the work of it. It's really beautiful. Promo code for the film, if anybody wants to zoom in, dublab1, you can stream. Stuart, do you want to explain, do they go to desolationcenter.com to stream the film if they haven't seen it yet or want to see it again?
Yeah, so that would be great. Is if you go to desolationcenter.com, you'll see Mariksa has set it up so that you click on another link, which goes to Vimeo on demand. So you can use your promo code. You can get a discount, and it also helps benefit Dublab, which is part of the whole thing we're doing here. So I would encourage you to go about it that way. Just go to desolationcenter.com. It's pretty clear once you get there, and the promo codes are there. And I'm not sure how long that'll last after today, but at least through the weekend, you should be able to do that.
Somebody else here, and you don't know if something's a joke or serious. Does bisexuality exist? And they're saying my mom is straight edge. So taking that, like, whether it is maybe somebody who's honestly asking if you are at home and your parents, don't understand you. The plurality and the multitude is wonderful of our world, and express yourself in many different ways. So urge you to to travel and venture and journey. Thank you all for being on this journey. It's been fun, to speak with Stuart Swezey here, the director of the film, the person who got the Desolation Center off the ground, Mariksa Leyssius, photographer, musician, participant, documentarian, zine maker, producer of the film, Steve Shelley of Sonic Youth, musician, label runner, on and on and on. You're all such inspiring folks, and to the audience, for being here. Really appreciate all of you for tuning in, and hope you can, if you haven't seen the film, watch it, desolationcenter.com, tell a friend. And it's, I find it very inspiring. So thank you all for being part of this conversation. And for that that amazing dog.
And his name
is Steve.
His name is Steve.
Amazing. Two Steves.
Thanks, Frosty. Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you. Thanks, Frosty, and thanks, Mariksa and Steve, for doing this with us. And
Thank you,
hey,
Dublab.
Yeah,
Listen to Dublab.
Check out Dublab. And that was a great set, Steve. I loved listening to it.
It was
so
fun
great.
to make.
It'll be archived up on Dublab, so definitely check it out again. And so, all right, peace, everybody. Do your thing, be creative, and thank you all so much.
All right.
Adios.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Back in the 80s, we put on parties in the desert, and we called ourselves Desolation Center.
Is the punk movement part of the Nazi movement?
No, that's the police. That's the Nazi movement.
The early 80s was a time of experimentation and rebellion.
The LAPD freaked out about punk rock like it was the second coming of the Black Panthers.
I started thinking I need to apply some of the out-of-the-box punk rock thinking. Why couldn't we put this kind of really cool music into this desert environment? How many things could go wrong,
I immediately understood the element of danger and the element of feeling alive are actually connected.
Everything that I found exciting at the time, all here in this remote spot.
Total anarchy.
That desert environment is awesome for acts of freedom.
Desolation Center was one of the inspirations when we started doing Burning Man.
It was beyond the theory, you know, it was made real. This gig makes total sense.
And I just remember thinking, this is transformative. Those shows reflected that spirit of, I'm going to make it happen.
It was definitely one of those doors that opens and you're kind of different on the other side.
I was kind of hoping to see the hillside come down on everybody, but that's my disappointment.